So thanks very much, and again, welcome, and thank you for coming to this research seminar, which is organised by the International Engagement Subcommittee of the Centre for Research and Pedagogy and Practice here at NIE. It's our pleasure to welcome Professor Toby Greany this afternoon. He is a Professor of Leadership and Innovation at the Institute of Education, which is a part of University College London, and is also Director of the London Centre for Leadership in Learning. Before joining the IOE, Professor Greany was the Director of Research and Policy at the National College for School Leadership for 7 years, and he's also worked at the Design Council and also in the Campaign for Learning and in the Cabinet Office in the United Kingdom. So this session this afternoon then, Professor Greany is going to explore the institutional and systemic factors that help and/or hinder change and innovation across school systems, and his focus will be on the evidence and examples that he has from England, and I'm sure that he will try to make it possible for us to make connections with the work that we do here in Singapore. And he told me that there will be some time for discussion during his presentation, and also there will be some time for Q&A at the end, where we can also explore some of these issues together. So, Professor Toby, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome from me, colleagues. It's great to have you here. I'm very keen that this is a dialogue. I'm going to be drawing particularly, I'm, as Phil said, my background is in policy and research, and so I'm interested in particularly kind of the ways in which evidence informs policy and practice, and the kind of interaction, the flows of evidence through education systems. I'm now also have been for the last 10 years at least, very much focused on leadership and the role of leaders in complex education systems. So the kinds of research I do, probably the main study I'm drawing on today and that I'm working on at the moment, is a 2-year study where we're looking at the development of the school system in England, which, as you may be aware, is a system that's changing very fast, and I'll talk about some of the changes. What we're doing in the study is we're coming to the end of it now. We're trying to pull all the different strands together, but what we've done is 4 locality case studies where we've gone into about 50 schools in total, and we've interviewed about 170 school leaders, middle leaders, teachers, as well as regional and local authority middle tier professionals. We've put that together we've done something called the egocentric analysis, where we've asked head teachers in each of the schools to use a performer to capture their key partnerships, and we've explored their partnership work in great depth. The reason for that is that we're drawing on the governance literature for our conceptual framework of the project. So effectively what the governance literature, or the meta-governance literature, posits is that you have 3 key forces driving social policy in many areas, not just in education. You have hierarchy, which is broadly, government action, often in England enacted through the accountability framework, where we have, it's great to hear that you abolished your school inspections many years ago now. In England, we have a very tight accountability framework, and particularly a school inspection model, which holds schools very much accountable for their performance, and schools are graded, and the reports are published, and either you're outstanding, or you're good, or you're requiring improvement, or you're inadequate. And so that's one of the key aspects of the hierarchy aspect of the school system. Then you have markets, and in our school system in England, we have parental choice of school. Parents can choose which school they want to send their child to, and although it's a quasi-market, they don't pay, but it's a publicly funded education system. Nevertheless, schools are competing for students because students bring resources, and so they're competing to try and classically, in the kind of economists' literature, they're competing to improve so that they attract more students, is the argument. And then thirdly, you have networks as the third driver of activity in publicly funded public education, public systems, where you've got, this is drawn from a lot of the literature looking at, for example, things like the environmental movement, where you have relatively spontaneously forming networks that shape alternative agendas and that often challenging hierarchy and markets and saying, no, there's a different way of doing things. And so what we've done in this project is explore those aspects of hierarchy, markets and networks, both through the locality case studies, the egocentric analysis. We did a survey of 700 head teachers. We've done something called propensity score matching, where you're matching schools against equivalent schools that have the same characteristics. And we've been particularly looking at whether or not schools that are in networks, in particular the multi-academy trusts which have developed, which are kind of groups of schools with a single board run as a single group, are schools in those networks, the hard governance networks, doing better or worse than schools with the same characteristics but that are in other models, so standalone academies and maintained schools. What that seems to be showing is that the small networks of 2 and 3 schools are making a positive impact, the bigger networks are not, and in fact the biggest networks, 15 plus schools, are making a negative impact on pupil outcomes. So that's one of the projects I'm drawing on. I'm drawing on others as well, and I'll talk about them as I go through, but I just thought that was helpful context. So I gave a public lecture on Tuesday where I talked about some of the global and the national and the local and the school level challenges that we face and the ways in which leaders respond to those challenges and try and lead effective schools in that context. I think everyone would agree that the world is changing ever more rapidly, and how we think about and shape education for children in the 21st century is a constantly evolving challenge. How do we try and design learning experiences which will equip young people to address challenges that we're still grappling with ourselves? Globalization, global warming, the clash of civilizations, or whatever you call it, the kind of significant challenges we're facing in our social world. And one of the kind of broad policy responses to those, to the fact that the world is more complex, that knowledge is evolving ever more rapidly, that curricula cannot remain constant, is to say we can't do it all from the centre anymore. We can't run an education system from government. We need to give schools more autonomy, and we need school leaders to have more freedom to be able to shape contextually appropriate responses that meet the needs of their particular communities. Because if we try and control everything at the centre, then we can't move quickly enough. I think what that throws up then, if we think about kind of, how policy is trying to respond to the challenges that it's got, is actually a set of what I call paradoxes that school leaders are then asked to resolve. So on the one hand, policymakers may say, we're going to give you autonomy, we're going to give you freedom, you have to decide what's right for your school and your context, and yet at the same time we want to control you because it's in the national interest to do so, because it's publicly funded money, we need to make sure you're spending that money effectively, and so on and so forth. We want you to deliver good standards in the basics, maths, science, home language, whatever it might be, because those are the things we can measure and because we think those things are really important, but we also want you to deliver a broad and balanced curriculum. We want parents to have choice, to have different types of schools that they can send their children to that specialise in different things, because that's what consumers, that's what they expect. When they go to the shopping mall, they expect to have choice, so surely they should have choice. And that also forces you to operate in a market to be more effective. But we want equity, and yet we know that when you give choice, the risk is that some parents, particularly the middle class parents, exercise that choice more actively, more effectively. They make sure that their child gets to the school where they'll be with other middle class children and where they'll be most likely to go on and succeed in life and so on. And so you have a challenge with equity in choice-based systems. we want academic stretch. We want the brightest of students to be pushed to develop, and yet we want to close the gap to make sure that all children are achieving as well as possible. We want schools to compete, but we also want you to collaborate. So this is a set of, I would argue, natural. This is a criticism of policy particularly. I think it's a natural consequence of devolution to schools and to ask leaders to try and resolve these challenges. But it leads us to an ever more passionate kind of focus on how do leaders do it, how do we try and make sure that across school systems with diverse schools, we have leadership capacity that is able to do these things that we're asking. And I could talk for hours about any of these individual headings. I mean, we have all these different models and theories of leadership. I think the most powerful to kind of bear in mind is this notion that, you know, we cannot rely on a model of the hero head teacher doing it all. We have to think about leadership as a process of influence, a process which happens at every level of a school, with teachers, students, middle leaders, senior leaders, community members, can all influence the direction of the school, and the role of the principal, the head teacher, is to try and orchestrate that process of influence to make sure that it's as coherent and has the momentum to move in the right direction. So what I want to do next is just, and this is rather crude, so go with me for a moment, but what I want to do is argue that there are broadly 4 models of school system reform that policymakers around the world are adopting. I'm putting England as it's a case on its own in that case, in this instance. And then I wanted you to ask you to kind of position Singapore against those 4 models. So the first one is drawn particularly, it's learning from the experience of Ontario, which saw significant improvements in student outcomes on international benchmarking over the course of the 2000s. And Ben Levin, Michael Fullan, some of the people who were most involved in that journey, talk about tri-level reform. The tri being about alignment between the centre, the district, the local authority, whatever you call it, and the school. And what the aim of that improvement focus is to try and keep that alignment going, to make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction, which you do through these 8 key activities in their view. Keep the focus on a small number but of ambitious but achievable goals, which links to number 6. Don't get distracted by whatever, you know, the newspapers or the parents or the latest crisis may risk derailing you. Try and keep your focus on those key goals. Keep a positive stance. This isn't about a language of blame, about saying our teachers aren't working hard enough, our schools aren't good enough. This is about trying to say this is really good and this is where we could be even better. Build capacity. This is fundamental, and capacity here does mean skills, knowledge and expertise, and I think there's a key part which doesn't come through in this as much as, I think if they were writing it today, they would probably emphasise the kind of knowledge mobilisation bit of this more, which is how do you move expertise around between schools and within schools so that we can all learn from and with each other and from the evidence base. But here they're talking about capacity building as both skills, everything you do here through the Academy of Singapore Teachers and so on, but also resources, making sure that the schools that faces the greatest challenges have got the right resources in place to be able to address challenges, and so on and so forth. Multi-level engagement with strong leadership and a guiding coalition. This is about, again, relates back to number 1. It's how do you try and keep this tri-level show on the road? You get the guiding coalition, so if you've got, you know, in their case in Ontario, it was a relatively low-performing state within Canada. It had a very unionised teaching workforce, and whenever ministers tried to introduce a change, the unions would go on strike. And so the guiding coalition for them was particularly about bringing the unions in and saying, okay, this can't go on, how are we going to work together to try and get better and improve together, and not see it as a battle to kind of, you know, beat the unions down. It was to bring them with them. Continuous learning, innovation and use of research and data. doesn't need a lot of explaining. I think some of the things they've done and that has happened certainly in the London Challenge, which I'll come on to, and that you do here, you have your benchmarking data so that you are able to see which of the schools that have the same characteristics as mine, how are they doing, can I learn something from how they're doing with particular groups of students or in particular subjects, so that there's more encouragement to share. And the continuous innovation bit, I talked this morning to the LEP group about building cultures of innovation in schools. I think it's both about fundamentally I think it's about cultures and about how you build trust so that people feel confident to make mistakes. Not confident to make mistakes, but it's okay to make mistakes and to learn from that. And it's about kind of building cultures in which professional learning and new ideas can bubble up, as well as top-down ideas from principals that, we're going to transform technology and introduce collaborative learning skills and other such things can equally be introduced in ways which the staff understand and feel are valid responses to change. Number 7, effective use of resources, doesn't really need explaining. Strong implementation effort to support the change process. So in order to make this happen, you need to kind of make sure you've got the resources and the momentum going so that you're both supporting the change leaders and kind of understanding how it works at that front end, whilst at the same time helping those that are struggling to keep up and to keep on board the bus, so to speak. So that's the first of my models, tri-level reform. The second, now all of these overlap. I don't want to pretend these are completely distinct, but I'm going to say that the second is strongly influenced by Michael Barber's work at McKinsey particularly. I'm sure you're all aware of how the world's most improving school systems come out on top and the importance of teachers and teaching and so on. Back before that was even published, he was already using this framework and it's influenced thinking around the world. Where broadly he says, if you want to change your school system, the first job is to diagnose the context and understand where is it now, because the response, the way in which you then move forward, will need to be attuned to where you're starting. So if you're trying to move your system from awful to adequate, then the kinds of change that you would need to introduce, whether you're the government, the profession, or the kind of relationships and public perceptions that you want to generate, at this level it's about being quite prescriptive, tackling the fact that in some instances you may not have enough classrooms, enough teachers, enough textbooks, enough desks, and so actually you've got to put some basics in place. And even if you have got enough teachers, they're not necessarily got the skills, they haven't been through the initial teacher education programs and so on. And so you're being quite tight about this is how we're going to teach, this is what we're going to teach, this is when we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to do it. So it's about minimum standards. The relationship can be, and this is the kind of back to the Ontario situation, quite antagonistic and feel quite driven from the top down, but it's necessary because you've got to move forward. And the public will be saying you should have done that years ago. If you want to move from adequate to good, then you're starting to build a kind of sense of professional standards. This is what good teaching looks like. You might have a competency framework. How do you qualify to become a teacher? What does good teaching look like? What does a good school look like? And so what you're trying to now build is capacity so that everyone can meet those standards and the best people can start to move beyond them. So transparency, publishing data about which schools are doing really well, which ones need to improve, building capacity, injecting evidence into the system to say, well, this is good, but this doesn't reflect what we know about good quality schools. Promoting best practice, encouraging people to learn from that. It's a kind of negotiated, pragmatic relationship between government and the profession. And the public, the parents, remain relatively sceptical. We'll believe this when we see it. If you want to move from good to great, often what the phrase Joel Klein, the former mayor of New York, used, the phrase unleashing greatness, actually did come from Michael Barber again. Then you can no longer rely on government and the bureaucrats to know what the best course of action is, because actually they're not the ones working in schools, they're not the ones who are really pushing things forward. You need to devolve power, decision-making, resources as much as possible down to schools so that they can start to drive their own improvement. And your role is to try and make sure that that's about an evidence-driven process. It's about trying to ensure consistency so that the learning does spread. You have a strategic partnership between government and the profession, but it's increasingly the profession driving things forward. Now, I have to say, I think this is a very compelling argument. It makes, kind of makes sense, doesn't it? When you go back and read the 2010 McKinsey report, how the world's most improving systems keep getting better, it's quite hard to see systems where really you can see that this is happening. And I think there's been quite a lot of misunderstanding about what unleashing greatness means. So in England, I would argue, we have taken this and kind of assumed it means give schools complete autonomy and let them go, and stepped back. The role of government has stepped back very significantly, and I'm not sure there's an evidence base to support that that's happening around the world and working effectively everywhere. The third model, and if I'm honest, this is a kind of mixture of tri-level reform and the kind of a bit of good to great, is the London Challenge programme. So London, back in the early 2000s, was the lowest performing region of England. It's the most deprived and with the greatest gaps in terms of high socioeconomic status and very low socioeconomic status in terms of the population. It's a very diverse population. And the view at the time was, London's broken. If you live in London and you've got money, you send your children to private schools. We can't recruit teachers, nobody wants to work here because the behaviour is really bad, the condition of the buildings is bad, and so on and so forth. And so the Labour government that was in power at that time, so a centre-left government, decided that that wasn't acceptable and that they wanted to do something about it. So they created the London Challenge programme, which ran for 6 years, 2003 to 2009. It was later expanded and moved, equivalent programmes ran in Greater Manchester and the Black Country, and it's informed national policy very significantly. Now, there was lots that happened in London, and I don't have time to kind of talk in detail about it. I think some of the key elements of what was important in London. So, sorry, just to jump ahead. London today is the highest performing region in the country. Children on free school meals, the lowest socioeconomic group, do better than the average of non-free school meal children in the rest of the country. It's been a remarkable turnaround. There are disputes about, was it London Challenge? Was it just London Challenge? Was it London Challenge and the fact that the economy in London is thriving, and so there's more motivation to do well because you can get a good job at the end of it? Is it actually diversity? I've said it's the most diverse in terms of multicultural part of the country. Does that help? Because actually it's often the non-white British groups that are doing the best in terms of academic attainment. I don't buy that completely because, for example, if you look at Tower Hamlets, which is a very deprived borough in London with a very large Bangladeshi community, the same community from the same part of Bangladesh also live in Bradford, a town in the north of England, which has one of the lowest sets of outcomes. So it's not always, it doesn't quite stack up for me that it's just about multiculturalism, but I think that may be an aspect of it. It's also the most competitive because it's the most urban part of our school system. So there are all sorts of explanations of why London's improved. It seems to me that the London Challenge was certainly part of that journey because it wasn't improving before London Challenge, and it has improved since and continues to improve. So what were the key parts of the London Challenge? I think it was about, there was a coherent government focus. We had a schools commissioner, Sir Tim Brighouse, who set a tone which was in tune with the tri-level approach in a sense. He didn't talk about failing schools, he talked about keys to success schools that if we could turn them round, that would shape London and start to really turn the curve in terms of attainment. He had a team of challenge advisors who would work with those keys to success schools. There was about 20 secondary schools initially, and they were working with those schools which were really struggling, and they would broker a package of support. So they would get into the school, they'd understand what the issues were, and they'd say, okay, so you need some extra help with maths, you need some extra help with middle leadership, you need some extra help with how you deal with non-English speaking, English as an additional language students, and so on and so forth, and they would bring that package together to help the school to improve. Through that process emerged the idea of system leadership. So this was, London had been a very competitive system. If you were a good school, you had a big drawbridge that you pulled up after the children had come in the morning, and you closed your doors, and you made sure that no other school learned from you, because otherwise they might get better and then you wouldn't attract as many students in the future. And you certainly didn't compete with other good schools or with weak schools, because you were too busy doing your own job, thank you. System leadership started to shift that and said, well, actually, some of the best schools in London came together and said, actually, we have a moral responsibility to support some of these key to success schools. And so Tim Brighouse, if he says to us, can you lend me some of your maths teachers to go and support the maths teachers in this struggling key to success schools, we would do that. And the head teacher maybe would go in and work there 2 days a week to help lead it and turn it round, and so on and so forth. And so emerged this model of school-to-school support and system leadership, where it was seen as critical that as a good school, it was part of your moral purpose. And actually, what we learned in the process of doing all of that was you got better at the same time, because taking your practice as a head of maths in a school that's doing really well and having to then support a colleague in a school that's struggling with a very different intake and a very different context helps you to become better at what you do. You become more metacognitively aware of your practice, and so you actually improve your own practice. It also has downsides. It stretches your capacity because you're having to work in 2 schools, not 1. So I'm not saying it's easy and I'm not saying it's perfect, but it was part of a process of improvement, I think, in London that has survived beyond the end of the London Challenge. And then we have, I'm going to kind of suggest England's system as a further kind of fourth model. It takes elements of the London Challenge. What we did was we took that idea of system leadership and school-to-school support, and when I was at the National College, we created a national framework to do the same kind of thing, where we would designate national leaders of education in very strong, successful schools, and then we would broker them to support underperforming schools. And more recently, since 2010, we've designated teaching schools, and these are outstanding schools that then work with an alliance of partner schools to provide initial teacher education, continuous professional development, leadership development, school-to-school support, and also research and development, so evidence-informed practice work. So just to briefly kind of walk you through England's school system, I describe it as a high autonomy, high accountability system overall. We have school autonomy in the sense that schools in England on PISA, for example, have more decision-making rights than any other school system in the world except the Netherlands. So they control the budget, they control the staffing, they appoint and recruit and fire if necessary their staff. They can, if they're an academy, which is about just over 1 in 4 schools, they don't have to follow the national curriculum. They can decide what pedagogy and so on and so forth that they want to adopt. So they're very autonomous schools in that sense, but they're also very accountable, as I've said. They have a set of performance measures that they have to achieve in terms of GCSE scores and end of primary, Key Stage 2 tests. Those results are published and all the schools are ranked, and then they're inspected and graded, outstanding, good, requires improvement, and so on. And if they're judged inadequate by Ofsted, then the head teacher is probably loses their job, and the school is taken over by an academy chain, a group of schools that takes over and runs that school and turns it round. At the same time, they have this lateral accountability to parents, arguably in a market, because they're trying to attract parents to choose their school, and they need to demonstrate that they're a good school so that parents want to go to their school, and then funding follows the learner. Now, there are some positives to this model. I think there is evidence that this has positives. We know from a number of studies which have looked at particularly kind of PISA data. Hanishek is probably the most substantial piece on this. Correlational research indicating that where you have school systems with high levels of school autonomy, that correlates with high outcomes. So it seems that more decentralised systems are often higher performing. Equally, having a sharp accountability framework, clarity about what are we trying to do, what does good look like, can help to create a shared sense of what are we trying to do and what does good look like. And so it allows us to share and collaborate more because we have a shared language and notion of what good looks like. However, there are also downsides. So in quasi-market systems, what you see is local hierarchies of schools. So some schools are seen as the good schools, some schools are seen as the sink schools that nobody wants to go to. In the middle of the hierarchy, you have the schools that are trying desperately to move their way up the hierarchy by attracting students who are easier to teach in the main. And they do that by spending more money on marketing, and they spend more money on facilities often. They build a swanky new swimming pool or whatever it might be, because that will attract those easier to teach students, and that allows them to move up the hierarchy because then they can get better results and so on. And what you see when you look across the evidence on quasi-market systems is that there is a small positive impact on outcomes, but it's very differential. So some schools get much better, some schools get worse. So it's not an equal improvement. So you get increased stratification in terms of children from particular backgrounds clustering in particular schools, children from poorer backgrounds clustering in other schools, and you get, in the high accountability framework, a narrowing of the curriculum and teachers teaching to the test. So, in 2010, we had an election, and we had that system that I've just described under the Labour government. We've had it from 1988 through until 2010, and seen, some improvement, but not great improvement in the school system. When the coalition, the centre-right coalition, was elected in 2010 and then was elected in 2015 as a purely Conservative government, we saw a big shift in the policy framework. So, whereas Labour's model had been a quasi-market, high autonomy, high accountability, but with quite a strong central drive to a lot of the improvement effort, what the Conservatives have done is strip away a lot of that and said, we want to give schools even more autonomy and we want government to step back. I won't go through the detail of all of that, but that's the kind of broad direction of travel. This is from the white paper that they published in 2010, which I think captures the kind of what they were trying to do. But they said the primary responsibility for improvements rests with schools. Our aim should be to create a school system which is self-improving. We know that teachers learn best from other professionals, and we'll make sure that schools are in control of their own improvement and make it easier for them to learn from one another. Now, I think it's possible to argue that this is trying to address some of the weaknesses in the high accountability, high autonomy system I've just described, because it's sharpening the focus on school accountability and school autonomy. It's saying, you are the ones who have to improve. It's not the local authority, it's not the national agency's job, you're the ones who've got to do it. We're going to strip away the local authority and the national agencies as much as possible so that our role is reduced and we unleash greatness and let you get on and do it. But we recognise that if that leads to just ever sharper competition and increased stratification, then that won't be positive. And so we put in place these two aspects in the middle here. We want teachers and schools to learn from each other and from research so that effective practice spreads. We want to move expertise and knowledge around so that there isn't that sense of a drawbridge coming up after the children have entered in the morning. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to ask the system leaders, the best schools and the best leaders, to work across several schools as national leaders of education, as teaching school leaders, and increasingly now as multi-academy trust leaders, where they're running multiple schools in one tight governance structure with one board, overseeing sometimes 60 schools in one group. I'm on the board of a group of 6 primary schools, all in very deprived contexts. We're one board overseeing all 6 schools. We have one budget. We employ all the staff in those 6 schools, for example. So, just for a couple of minutes, can I just ask you to think in pairs or in threes, where would you put Singapore on those 4 models that I've described? Which one best describes what's happening in Singapore? And where does Singapore differ from all 4? What's different here? Couple of minutes?
Just the unit. Using something else.
Okay, can I pause you there, colleagues? Anyone want to volunteer? Any thoughts? If you had to choose one of the 4, which would you choose?
We were discussing, it seems that Singapore's model is a bit of everything, but primarily I think it's the 4th one, which is a self-improving system and school networks that we seem to be looking at in today's context.
Yeah. I know you've got this strong focus on network learning communities, functional learning communities, clusters. Yeah. Yeah. And I know I've heard several people, particularly when I was at AST, talk about kind of teacher-driven improvement as well, and that notion of
Rounds up kind of
bottom up. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone contradict? Anyone see very differently? I think I would that I can see that. I would say I can also see a lot of tri-level reform, because you have a very strong kind of MOE, NIE, AST schools, you know, in a very tight kind of framework, which feels quite more like a tri-level reform model. So I think it's kind of, for me, it's a combination of those two, it feels. Anyone else? Yeah.
We've used this phrase, it sounds rather colloquial, but it's a tight, loose, tight approach.
Yeah.
So meaning the first tight is when it comes to direction, possibly national level vision, you know, for schools. That said, that has a tendency to be more tight. Where it's more loose is the translation that happens within schools in certain aspects. And then when it becomes tight again, it's the accountabilities.
Yeah.
Right? So, for example, our national exam system is an example of a tight, you know, accountable approach. Yeah.
And it's funny how that, you could argue, is here.
Yes, but I feel that the high autonomy, I think for Singapore, the autonomy that is given seems to be rather, it's not autonomy in the same degree in all aspects of leadership and management of schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some aspects there are more autonomy than others.
And certainly, my memory is you don't come out particularly highly on PISA in terms of what your principles describe as areas of autonomy. I think you come about the middle internationally on that respect.
Well, it could be what the principals perceive is autonomy to them.
Yes, it's a very relative term, it is, I agree. Okay, so mixture of different strategies, inevitably, rightly, in every school system. What I want to do now in the second half is just delve a bit more into England's journey and what, from the research that I described and other research, we're seeing in terms of kind of the development of the self-improving school-led system. So first thing to say, so I mean the big thrust of this, as I've said, is about school networks, school-to-school support, schools working together to share expertise and practice and to support each other to improve, schools training the next generation of teachers, and so on and so forth. So it's important just to kind of flag this gap in our evidence base about, do networks actually lead to, or do they seem to be associated with improvement? I would say the evidence base is emerging. I mean, there is some evidence. This second one, although it's from 2008, and there's quite a lot of research since then, which does indicate that school-to-school support, particularly where a strong school supports a weaker school to improve, you see significant improvements in pupil outcomes over 3 years. It takes 3, 4, 5 years to come through for that impact to emerge, but where you have that, then there is evidence that it makes a positive difference. I've talked about the research that I'm doing at the moment, suggesting that it's only in relatively small groups, 2 and 3 schools, and that getting too big too quickly seems to be associated with less improvement. But nevertheless, it's important to kind of say this is still emerging. We need to be cautious about how we interpret this evidence. This is something I use a lot with school leaders in England who are involved in these partnerships. And what I'm seeing from the locality, the 4 locality case studies that I talked about, is that across England, 21,000 schools have always collaborated, but they've now, in the last few years, recognised that collaboration and partnership is actually kind of increasingly fundamental to what they do and to how they work, because they can no longer rely on the local authority to provide courses and support and so on. And so they have to think, how are we doing this with our partners? And broadly, the response when we look at both the survey data and the qualitative data is, when a school recognises it has an improvement priority, we need to get better at boys reading. It'll look first internally, can we solve this ourselves? If it's something we feel we can't solve ourselves, then we look to our partner schools and we say, who's the school, which school is it that we know does this really well, coupled with which school leader do I trust enough to go in and say, we're not doing this very well, can I come and look at your practice, can my teacher work with your teachers please, and so on and so forth. And then thirdly, if they can't solve it within their cluster, within their network, then they go further afield. So I asked them to say, well, what are the reasons that you partner with each other, and what evidence do you have that your partnerships are making a difference? And these 2 lists, the first and second on the left, are drawn from private sector partnerships. And you might think that there wouldn't be parallels in education, that schools would only collaborate for these reasons, because we think it's going to allow us to offer a richer curriculum to children, because we think our teachers can learn from working with other schools, the kind of school improvement and broadening the opportunities kind of agendas that Daniel Moyes and Mel West and Mel Ainscough pointed. Or it might be about making efficiencies, efficiencies from scale and so on. And yet actually, it's interesting how often these rationales also come through. So for example, I interviewed a leader in a multi-academy trust school who, it's quite hard to explain the policy, but there was a very rapid change in policy about which students could be entered, about only being able to enter children for an exam once, whereas schools had been entering children multiple times for an exam. So if they failed, they just got entered again and they got entered again. And so what schools were doing was entering children from the exams quite early, 2 years in advance of when they had to do it, and kind of thinking, well, we'll just enter them 5 or 6 times and eventually they'll get it, because that makes us look good. And so the policy was to stop that and say you can only enter them once, which was announced on a Thursday, and you had to decide for that year's children whether you were going to enter them for the exam on the Friday. So it was a very tight decision. It was very unpopular with schools. What this leader in a multi-academy trust said to me is, we knew about the decision on the Sunday, because we're part of a multi-academy trust. Our chief executive has dinner with the minister. He knew about it before everyone else, so we had a whole week to get ready. So you can see how access to information might be one of your reasons actually for forming a partnership. I'm not saying that's a legitimate reason. I'm simply saying that being honest about what are we going to get from this partnership and why are we doing it is a really important consideration. I'm going to scan through that because of time. This is from some work I did with Professor David Hargreaves. He wrote a series of think pieces about what does a self-improving system look like, involve, what are the things we need to think about. And one of the things he would do a lot with groups of school leaders, this was back kind of just after the 2010 reforms had started to develop and the first teaching schools in England were starting to work with their alliances, with their partners. And he would ask them, he would say, there are 2 aspects to partnership working to be really clear about. One is the level of structure, the inter-school integration and structure. So in a loose structure, you have 2 completely separate schools choosing to do some work together, but without any governance around that, without any framework around it, you just get on and do something. In a tight structure, it would be more like the multi-academy trust that I explained I'm on the board of. You have one governance board, you're one organisation, and that allows you to do much more structured collaboration, and importantly means that it's no longer dependent on individuals getting on with each other, because actually it's a permanent arrangement, and if those individuals leave, it's still the arrangement, and you need to work out how to make it continue to work. Because what we see all the time is that partnership working is based on interpersonal relationships, which is can be a positive thing, but those relationships can break down, people can leave, and that makes it somewhat fragile. Along the bottom, you need to think about the culture of your partnership. Is it shallow? We share a few things, but we don't really trust them. We're still in competition. Or is it deep? We share all our data, we trust them, we care passionately, we care as much about their children and their success as we do about our own children. And when you ask schools to say, where are you now? In England, normally, they're somewhere here. And if you ask them, where do you want to be in 3 years' time? This is the most common direction of travel. So we want to develop the culture, the depth of the partnership. We're a bit nervous about becoming too structured too quickly, because that might risk giving up some of our power and some of our autonomy, and we kind of want to just take it slowly. His argument is that you need to think about structure as well as culture, because if you don't, then you are too dependent on personalities and don't have that sustainability. There's a growing body of literature in England about system leadership and how do you lead across partnerships. When you're in your own schools, leading your single school, these kind of skills and qualities down the left-hand side, we know from lots of leadership research over the years that because these are the kind of things you need to be able to do, you need to be able to set direction, command authority, be accountable, champion your institution, exercise performance management, and delegate decision making, the kind of distributed leadership aspects. All of which, whilst it's not easy, is arguably possible because you have a position of power. You are the principal, and at the end of the day, you can tell people what to do, and you're able to shape your organisation. Once you start to work in a partnership with other principals, you don't have that position of power to the same extent. And so you have to lead ever more through influence. And so the kinds of skills that you need over here, persuading through vision, understanding different organisations, modelling collaboration, influencing direction, offering opportunities, persistence and perseverance, co-constructing solutions. The new skill set for many of the leaders in the English school system, particularly those teaching school heads. We've seen many of them get it wrong because they've either tried to control too much, or they've tried to imply, we're an outstanding school, we've been designated as a teaching school, we've got all the answers. And of course, their partners think, no thanks, I don't want to be told what to do, I want a collaborative partnership where we can work together and share, but where you learn, I learn, we learn together. And what the best leaders do in these situations is create a culture where it is actually genuinely shared, even though they are also not controlling it, but influencing it through their ability to articulate a shared vision, through their ability to say, that's fine, we'll lend you our maths teacher, we'll give and be generous, because that sets a model that others will then start to buy into and say, yeah, okay, we'll play that game. We'll lend our maths teacher back if you need it. And in the middle, all sorts of skills and qualities of leaders that are arguably central in both models, but I think become ever more accentuated once you start to lead across a partnership rather than within a partnership. So I want to just then draw on some examples of partnerships that we've observed in the qualitative research that I've been doing, just to give you a sense of how does this actually play out in practice. So I'm drawing particularly here on a large rural county that I did most of the research in. And as you moved around the county, what you saw was most schools worked first and foremost in their local clusters, the same as you have here. Left over from the role of the local authority would encourage cluster working, often because of geography. A market town with one secondary school or maybe two secondary schools, maybe 10 primary schools, and that was a natural organisational structure for them to partner on. What was very striking though was that Sometimes you go to a cluster, and it was doing some really fabulous work together. Teachers were meeting regularly, moderating work together, doing lesson study across groups of schools, they would organise an annual or a termly joint inset day, a training day for all staff across the cluster. They would have a shared cluster plan which said these are the things we're going to focus on and these are the resources we're going to put behind it. You go to a cluster in the next town, 10 miles away, 20 miles away, nobody talks to each other. They meet, but they don't really share very much. And the schools that are kind of seeing that they need to collaborate are thinking, I can't make this cluster work. I'm going to go and join a teaching school alliance, even though it's 50 miles away, because I'd rather be in a good collaborative than in this more dysfunctional one. And so it seemed to be pretty much just the quality of the leadership, the level of trust, whether or not there happened to be, 2 or 3 head teachers who'd been around long enough and who believed in trying to make this work, whether or not this happened. And there wasn't really much more rationale to it than that. This was a really interesting cluster. So the secondary school had decided to become an academy, which just after 2010, for the first time, you could choose to become an academy and get all those extra freedoms that I talked about. And you got a lot of extra money as well. And it tended to be the secondary schools that did that. The primary schools were much more cautious. They were much more likely to be working with the local authority and to think, no, we don't want to become academies. This secondary head became an academy, and then he talked to his local primary schools and said, why don't we form a multi-academy trust, an academy chain, the structure that I talked about. And the primary schools were very nervous about this. They felt like it was being taken over by the secondary school. We want to keep our autonomy. No, thank you. And then a year or 2 later, the head suddenly realised that the primary schools had formed their own multi-academy trust without him, because they were, this is the way to protect ourselves from him taking us over. So he is now forming a multi-academy trust with another secondary school that's about 30 miles away in another local authority. And so you see how his arguably poor leadership, the fact that he didn't get those relationships right, he didn't build trust and take time and get it right, means that we've got a structure there which may now survive for 10 or 20 years, where children will be leaving primary school in one multi-academy trust, going into a different multi-academy trust, and the challenge of making that transition work will be all the harder than if it had been one multi-academy trust working collaboratively. In this same local authority, we went to one of the teaching schools that was trying to create this alliance of member schools to work together on professional development and so on. We also talked to a number of schools that were members of that alliance. What we saw was that it was interesting. So I think 6 of the schools that we talked to were members of that alliance. 4 of them were paying to be members. They went to some of the courses, they did some of the things with the teaching school. It was okay, but they weren't seeing it as hugely powerful or particularly effective. 2 of those member schools loved the alliance and thought it was fantastic, because they'd been involved in co-designing the provision early on, and so they felt much more ownership of it, much more investment in it, and much more that this was something that was meeting their needs. So going back to the leadership implications, what I say to leaders of teaching schools is, you need to make co-design something that is a permanent feature of what you do. Constantly thinking, how do we involve all of our stakeholders in shaping the way that we work, the things that we do together, so that we all have a shared ownership of it. It's not simply a service that we offer and that you buy because you don't value it to the same extent. And finally then, in this same local authority area, a soft federation of secondary schools. So this is a group of 11 secondary schools that had worked together for many years with a shared, they don't have shared governance body, but they have a kind of committee of head teachers that decides how they work together and the kinds of things they do together. About 3 years before we went in, the view was that this federation wasn't working very well. It wasn't really meeting the needs of the schools, and they were becoming more disparate. A new head in one of the schools came in, and he chaired the committee of head teachers. And he got them to agree, we're going to commit to a key performance indicator. We're going to say every school in this federation has to be at least good in Ofsted. And that once they made that commitment, it changed the nature of their partnership work because they had a much clearer sense of this is what we're now going to do, and these are the schools we're going to support, and this is the kind of success measure that we have. And the view was that this was now a strong federation working well together. Meanwhile, that same head teacher was working with his feeder primary schools to create a similar kind of structure, a similar federation structure, ready to become a multi-academy trust if he needed to. We talked to one of the primary schools that was a member of that group, and whilst we talked to others that were very positive about it, this one primary school, it was interesting because her school was a member of 2 networks. This group, which was spending a lot of time agreeing the committee structure and writing very formal memoranda of agreements and so on. And then she was also a member of another network that was just getting on and doing some stuff, and her teachers were out working in other schools, seeing, developing their practice together. And she felt, I can't carry on being a member of both, I've got to choose one. And she was going to choose the one that was getting on and doing stuff, because she was fed up with all the meetings about the structure and the process and not getting on and doing stuff. So, all of which is about, if you're leading in a partnership, how do you try and balance structure, having the formal agreement and the formal governance, with getting on and doing stuff, which is practical and makes a difference and builds trust? How do you get it right so that you avoid fragmentation and losing relationships and so on? How do you, as a local authority or as a cluster here my guess is that some of your clusters work better than others, and how do we try and understand the kind of features of strong cluster partnership working, and so on and so forth. When we look at most local authorities in England today, I think the risk of this whole system that we're creating is that we have a more two-tier system. We get some schools, the schools that are confident, that feel they have the capacity, they're loving it. To them, this is a much better way of working. They don't have the local authority telling them what to do anymore. They can decide what they need, they can go out and find it, and they see real benefit in having that sense of ownership. But we see other schools that are much less confident, that are nervous that the local authority is going, that don't have strong partnerships, and don't seem to have the capacity to be able to work in this much more self-improving model. And I won't go through all of this, but meanwhile, we have a Department of Education that's kind of struggling to try and make this system of 21,000 schools work. And I'll stop there. This is from a study by John Cauldron, Megan Crawford, Tim Simpkins, and Alan Jones. They've tracked a group of what they call well-positioned head teachers since 2010. These are not necessarily national leaders of education and teaching school heads, but they're head teachers of schools that were high performing in 2010, and so they were well placed to be able to take advantage, to become academies and so on and so forth. And I just thought this was a really good kind of encapsulation of some of the challenges we face in our system, because Stephen Ball, who's an academic at the Institute of Education, talks about having a culture of survivalism in schools. In order to be a successful head teacher and a successful principal in a very high stakes accountable system, the risk is that you become obsessed by proving that your school is good at the expense of everything else and at the expense of children's learning. And I think that's to some extent reflected in that quote. The head teachers they talked to tended to take a pragmatic view of how to respond to the changes, a logic of action that could be characterised as aiming to accumulate prestige while recognising its precarious nature and maximising their own room for manoeuvre, taking charge of their own destiny as far as possible. Being graded by Ofsted as at least good and preferably outstanding was what mattered most. The head teachers we interviewed thought it was inevitable that the weak would get weaker and the strong stronger. They felt that increasingly competitive local fields are creating winners and losers. Now, I think this is a real concern in the English self-improving school system. I think there are positive signs, and there are places where I see that the kind of network model that I've described is giving leaders confidence and kind of helping them to take much more ownership of change, the kind of idea of unleashing greatness, where you have a group of system leaders who set a kind of atmosphere that says we're going to work together and we're going to collaborate and we're going to find a way to make this work. So I don't want to pretend that it's all negative, but equally I think there are risks that the drivers and incentives in our system, the hierarchy and the markets, are often proving more powerful than the networks. Which is captured in this slide. In some places I go to, I see that leaders are proactive. They're going out, they're looking for partners, they're looking for how to make this work. They work and they assume that solutions can be found when you work collaboratively and collectively. And they tend to base their actions on a set of shared values. We're all interested in equity and in making sure that all children succeed, and we don't want to let the drivers in our system prevent that from happening. But then they're working with leaders who often are much more reactive. They're not thinking ahead about how they need to move their school forward as all these other changes take place around them. As a result, they're often quite nervous and focused inward, and they're quite compliance focused. They do what they're told to do. If they'll do it, they think it's in the Ofsted framework, but they won't do it because it's simply the right thing to do. Coupled with that, this is a further challenge from a chapter in a book that I've co-edited coming out later this year by Dan Dicton. There's a whole further set of changes. When you take away the local authority, which is democratically elected, how do you try and make sure that you keep your key stakeholders, your teachers, your parents particularly, on board so that they have some ownership of change? Because if you get that wrong, good evidence from the Netherlands, where they're even more autonomous than our schools, and they have school boards that are very similar to our multi-academy trusts. But there's a commonly held view, including in Parliament and including their Chief Inspector of Schools would argue, that they've lost legitimacy. They've not managed to keep teachers and parents on board. They've tried to innovate, but without enough buy-in, and so people have become quite negative about what's happening. And Dan is effectively arguing the same point here, which I won't read out, but unless the multi-academy trusts can demonstrate that they're making a difference to pupil outcomes, and at the same time demonstrate that they have ways of listening to the voices of staff and the voices of parents in their decision making, then those voices could feel increasingly marginalised and start to question whether or not this is really working. Another key challenge before I finish then is how do we make this work on a locality level? I firmly believe that education needs to work for every child, and schools need to meet the needs of all children within a locality. Once you have a system where schools are working in multi-academy trusts that might not be covering a locality, they might be spread geographically over a wide area, some schools might be left out of playing the football team, if you like, trying to make it work, but actually struggling. And this is from a chapter in the same book by colleagues of mine, Chris Crown, Chris Husbands, and David Woods, who argue that based on work in the London Challenge, in fact, in Tower Hamlets, that you need area-wide improvement, and everyone to benefit, not just a fortunate few who have found their way into more successful schools. And it seems to me making the school improvements, self-improving system work for every school and every child is one of our challenges in the system. All of which, to conclude then, for us, places a huge premium on leadership, and we need to do not, as this politician is urging us, to become ever more confused by the framework around us. But I think the premium on school leaders to try and make sense of the paradoxes of policy and to knit it together so that it works for children, so that schools don't fall between the cracks, so that they can create rigorous, productive, challenging, but beneficial collaborative structures is fundamental. Thank you very much.
Now we come to the Q&A session. Dr. Control will help to moderate the session. If you have any questions, could you just kindly state your name and organization followed by your question. Thank you.
Okay, would anybody like to start? No? Okay, then maybe I will take up the challenge of asking the first question. You know, some of these models, so that you've been talking about, are models for reform, and some of them are also models for improvement. So, so I wonder whether it's possible to have improvement without reform.
Oh, that's a good question. I used a quote this morning from a recent report for Wise by Joe Hallgarden and Valerie Hammond, who argue that, am I standing too close to this? I'm not sure. They argue that because school systems around the world have focused, understandably, on valuing the things they can measure, the exam results, we've become stuck in improvement mode. We can't seem to break out of a model of school is about learning stuff so that you can pass tests and exams, and therefore, if I understand your meaning of reform to be about trying to break out of that and try and do things differently and innovate, as well as, or instead of even simply focusing on improvement, I think there's a possibility. I think they're all about improvement.
Yes.
I think there's a possibility for this one and this one to be about reform and transformation. If the policy framework were to say we want to do things genuinely differently and we're going to start valuing some things other than just test results. And that seems to me what you're trying to do here in Singapore. You're trying to say we do really well in tests, but we want to do more than that. We want to do things differently as well.
Yes.
So I think it's possible to. I think the risks, the challenge is that it's quite hard to conceive of and take risks with children's learning when, those children's lives will be impacted, and yet, you want them to go to the right universities and do well in life and so on. So, it's a kind of tricky balance to strike. Charlie Ledbetter, in a publication that I was using in the session this morning, looks at models from around the world, in the slum in Bombay, let's say, where, schools don't exist necessarily or not for all, and very different models of learning and education can evolve, and ask, can we then retrofit those onto our school systems where we're more engaged in these kinds of models? So I think, it's a good question. Balancing the tension or balancing the kind of focus on each side of the question is an important aspect. An overly tight accountability framework seems to be the thing that will most mitigate against any kind of genuine innovation, because it constrains the outcome measures so tightly.
Yeah, that's right. I guess the issue is trying to pass off improvement as reform. So, we have improved, and so therefore we have changed the way in which we do things.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just my personal thought. Yes?
There is a tendency when we talk about giving more autonomy to schools and in working with partnerships, and that schools are expected to innovate, to do things differently. How much of what you saw in the schools, were the schools doing things that were evidence-based? Or was it more based on just that craft knowledge and experience and, sometimes even intuition? Yeah. My concern is that when we keep talking to schools and asking schools to innovate and be creative, actually there's a lot of research already about what is solid teaching and learning, what is good instruction. So how much of what the schools did led them to go back to evidence, to go back to research, even as they thought about the curriculum?
So, in responding, and this is what I was talking about on Tuesday evening, I'll also draw on, I'm just coming to the end of a 2-year evaluation of, for the Department for Education in England, of evidence-based teaching, which is kind of to what extent are schools using evidence in their work. And what I would say we're seeing is that there is a shift towards using evidence more in English schools. There are some schools we've looked at in some detail that seem to be using evidence strongly at all levels of the school, and teachers are able to articulate how they're drawing on evidence to inform their decision making. There are some really interesting things about them, even though the evidence, and if we draw on the kind of John Hattie kind of meta-review version of the evidence base, metacognition, peer tutoring, formative assessment, as arguably the most well-founded pedagogic strategies, for example, and yet you share that with schools and they draw very different conclusions about how that might inform their practice. So I'm not of the view that we can ever reach a kind of what works version of evidence where we know this works, everyone just has to do it. I think you have to have an informed professional debate and learning process which says, here's the evidence, and here's how we might try something different, and here's how we might evaluate that and understand whether it's leading to improvement in our context. So I think we are seeing schools that are doing that in a more sophisticated way. I don't want to pretend it's universal. We also tracked a cohort of both 200 schools and a qualitatively sample of 15 schools in a lot more depth, and saw very little shift over a 2-year cycle and relatively low levels of evidence use. So in the main, I think one of the big risks of the self-improving system, where you move away from kind of universities, local authorities, other external bodies having a role in kind of working with schools and helping them to improve, and you move to a system of kind of schools collaborating with each other, the risk is that you recycle practice that actually isn't very evidence-based, but we all, we've learned it from each other and it's what we always do. So, I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I think it also goes back to the accountability point I was making. I mean, in the main, our Ofsted framework is an evidence-based framework which says we know that schools that are, good schools seem to be doing these things, and so we're inspecting to see whether or not you're doing these things, which means that when schools focus on doing better in the Ofsted framework, they're focused on evidence-informed improvement. It is in quite a narrow paradigm, but it's nevertheless evidence-based, even if schools aren't really aware of what that evidence is saying. They're simply doing what they're told. And there's then a real challenge about, a real question, I think, about, to be an evidence-informed teacher or school, do I need to simply take as given that good pedagogy is based on formative assessment and just buy the formative assessment package and follow it? Or do I need to have read Dylan William, Paul Black, and all the different research on formative assessment and have understood the deep principles underpinning that before I can start to become a genuinely evidence-informed practitioner who uses formative assessment in everything he does? So it's another whole debate, isn't it? But it's an interesting one.
Thank you. Chris?
I was just wondering about the Ofsted framework that you talked about as evidence-based framework. But at the same time, I wonder to what extent context matter. But the context of schools in certain parts of London, in other parts of England, will be very, very different. And I just wonder to what extent context is taken into consideration in the way we look at school improvement and school reform.
Yeah, another fascinating question. Obviously the framework is a national framework that doesn't, it's written to try and encompass multiple contexts. Ofsted uses it across multiple contexts, and there are a lot of criticisms, and there are always going to be examples where the school that should have got an outstanding gets requires improvement and so on, and arguably therefore doesn't respond to context. I think shifting your question around slightly, although if I was to say this in England, I would be thrown out and hounded. I think it's important to remember some of the positives about what the Ofsted framework can do. When I go talk about that teaching school, it's in a really deprived context. It's got about 65% of its children are on free school meals, and yet it's an outstanding school. So what Ofsted allows is that a school that, before Ofsted, everyone would have just assumed it was no good because it dealt with a certain population of children, and if you're dealing with that population of children, you're probably not a very good school. Ofsted allows us to say, no, this is a fantastic school, this is a teaching school that's going to help other schools with much less deprived populations to learn about how to do things. And similarly, you get schools in very advantaged contexts that get very good results, being classed as requires improvement or inadequate by Ofsted, because arguably they should be doing a lot better than they are. So I think, you know, it has its equity function as well as its negative function. And that the examples I've given hopefully show that actually it can recognise its excellent practice in different contexts as well as challenge poor practice in other contexts.
Conventional wisdom tells us that, you know, maybe most schools or even teachers, they prefer to have autonomy. But, you know,
Sorry, just say again, but slightly louder.
conventionally, I mean, people will, I think schools or teachers may think that, you know, by giving me high autonomy, it is something that I can, there's some more locus of control, and it's something that's desirable. But then through our interviews with some principals, they were telling us that some schools or even teachers are actually fearful of autonomy. So I'm not too sure whether in your context you also face this kind of this kind of counterintuitive thing, as in, you know, autonomy doesn't come across as desirable at all. And I think I suppose this can be also linked to capacity building. So this could be one of the facets that underpins, you know, how people actually perceive autonomy. So I don't know what's your take on that.
We absolutely see that time and again. And, you know, the point I made about secondary schools are much more likely to have gone academy early. Primary schools are much more likely to have maintained under the local authority, is about confidence as much as anything. Secondary schools often have been doing a lot of the more autonomous kind of ways of working even when they were part of the local authority. The local authority often struggles to have really good people who can challenge a secondary school because they've worked in one and they know it, and they really know all the tricks and the games that leaders might play. Whereas primary schools are much more comfortable and fearful of the autonomy. So I think it is about capacity building. It's also one of those things that I think you just have to learn your way into. And so policymakers are kind of sometimes pushing it even against the resistance of schools. But they need to kind of, it tends to be quite counterintuitive for policymakers to give up power. Which policymaker wants to give up their own power base, you know? So, and if you then couple that with school leaders who are fearful of being given power, the risk is you end up with stasis. So,
but confidence is one thing, but isn't it also an issue relating to trust within the system? So I'm guessing that Yancey's point is this, is that if you suddenly come to me and say, you know, you're on your own now, you make your own decisions, I suppose the first thought that comes into your mind is, you know, as soon as I make a mistake or do something that somebody doesn't like, I'm going to get crucified.
yeah, I think that's true. And that first, on the four kind of features of the self-improving system, you are much more accountable as an academy, you know, and therefore your head is more on the block than it was before.
That's right, yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for one more comment or question. How about somebody on this side of the room? Seems to be the silent minority here. Somebody like to make a comment, ask a question? Paul?
Oh, I came in late, but okay, I'm trying to jump in. Okay, but I was looking at these four, this figure up there. I was just wondering, your question about where you would place Singapore in this reform model, and you having yourself seen the Singapore schools and so on. How would you rate the prognosis of us moving to something like self-improving system? Yeah.
I think
Sorry, I mean that.
What I'm thinking is,
Put you
what I'm
on the
thinking
spot.
is that, you know,
Put you on the spot.
a self-improving, the self-improving system is a kind of loose concept that nobody knows what it means. And so, if you want to be a self-improving system, you can. So I think if what you mean is, can you develop your network learning communities and your kind of cluster-based work to be very powerful as a kind of core model for school improvement? Yes, I think you can. If you were to try, I find it hard to imagine a world where Singapore would go down the English route of also closing down all the government agencies, asking schools to train the next generation of teachers, and kind of, stepping back from a lot of the things that the English government, a national curriculum, for example. I find it hard to imagine that here. I'm not sure that is essential to a self-improving system. I think the self-improving system bit has to be about school-to-school support and network-based improvement. And yes, I think you can do that. And I think you're already well underway.
There is evidence in Japan and other Asian countries that we used strong learning communities within the school, that school has reform. That reform comes within. And so there's some evidence coming up from some of the school systems in Japan, as well as Korea and in Korea, I think. Yeah.
And Shanghai as well.
And
I think,
yeah.
has elements of it. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask, so as such, do you think that, is there another way of thinking about accountability? Another way for the system to think about accountability that schools need to have? Because in the context of self-improving system, context of self-improving schools, should we start thinking about accountability differently?
Yes, certainly. I find it fascinating that you have scratch your school inspections, you have your external review process, and you have the accountability that comes with, how did you do on the key tests. So it's not that you don't have accountability driving your behaviour here, but it's a very different model to England. I've argued that in England what we should be doing is moving from single school accountability to cluster and network-based accountability. That if you hold the network accountable for performance, then that actually strengthens the sense of we have to all succeed, not just my school, but all of us. So for me, that would be the first shift. I've also said that you should only do that where you've got strong peer review happening. So where schools are prepared to review and challenge each other's practice, then they should be said, as long as they can prove that they're doing that in a relatively structured and rigorous way, then Ofsted should not visit them at all and simply say, we'll keep an eye on your results, but we won't inspect you anymore. If your results drop, we'll come back and start inspecting you again.
Okay, well, I think that's a really nice place to end. Thank you very much for that. Also, thank you to everyone for coming this afternoon and for listening, and also for your questions.